Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the third part of the Diane Sindall, Peter Sullivan arc. In the previous episode, I covered the prosecution's case against Sullivan at his trial in October 1987, and in this instalment, we shall hear from the defence. Join me as I continue to delve into the trial of Peter Sullivan as the defence deliver their evidence. On the 23rd of October 1987, those gathered at Liverpool Crown Court would hear the defence's opening argument, during which the counsel for 30-year-old Peter Sullivan stated his client was a terrible witness who would be at a disadvantage when cross-examined by the experienced prosecutor. Mr. John Kay told the court, "I expect Mr. Rankin will make a mincemeat of Mr. Sullivan. I was thinking about it as I drove in this morning, and if this was a boxing match, they would stop it before it started, and I don't just mean in terms of weight." About his client, Mr. Kay stated, "The defendant will be as bad a witness as you can get." In an effort to demonstrate the difference between the two men, Mr. Kay praised the opposition counsel, Mr. Andrew Rankin, as, quote, "one of the foremost cross-examiners in this country, if not in wider fields than that. A mismatch if ever there was one. I ask you to make allowances for that fact. One knows Mr. Rankin will endeavour to be fair, but there are some cases where even that fairness is not really enough." The defence counsel also admitted that his client was a foolish individual who was known to be untruthful, and this in turn had affected how he responded during his interactions with police, with Mr. Kay stating that Sullivan had been, quote, "quite hopeless in dealing with questions put to him." Concluding this, he added, "When he goes into the witness box, he is likely to be a dreadful witness. I do not shirk from bringing that fact to you." Having prepared the jury regarding his client's ineptitude, it came time for Peter Sullivan, dressed in a brown jacket and tie, to take to the stand. During his initial interactions with the defence counsel, Sullivan reiterated his assertion that he had not been on Borough Road nor Bidston Hill at the time the police claimed he had been, admitting that the closest he came to the murder scene was while he was an 8-minute walk away in the crime pub where he had been playing darts for the first time as a member of their team. He also conceded that he had at one point confessed to the murder, but claimed that this was only due to the stress of the situation, combined with the verbal abuse he received from the officers, the culmination of which had caused him to become depressed, and he felt he was in a hopeless situation. As the gentleness of Mr. Kay's questioning concluded, it came time for Sullivan to face cross-examination from prosecutor Mr. Andrew Rankin QC, who would focus on the many inconsistencies in Sullivan's statements. One such detail revolved around his ability to describe facets related to Bidston Hill, where Diane's belongings had been found burnt. Sullivan alleged he had not been to that location in roughly 15 years, prompting the prosecutor to ask, "Remember telling police you went through the gate and there was a gap at the side? Curiously enough, there is a gap there." Sullivan replied, "That was a wild guess." Another question pertained to Sullivan's knowledge regarding the contents of Diane's bag, with Mr. Rankin putting to Sullivan, "Why did you tell the police that included in the items took from Diane was a photograph of her and her boyfriend?" Sullivan responded, "I just guessed it." To which Mr. Rankin exclaimed, "Another guess?" prompting Sullivan to reply, "Yes, another guess. It came out of the air." Pushing the defendant further, Mr. Rankin pointed out that in total, Sullivan had provided the police with 13 statements regarding what occurred that night, all of which contained different accounts, some of which contradicted what he had previously stated. This multitude of inconsistent statements caused the prosecutor to suggest, "Is it the fact that you are a born and bred liar, a total stranger to the truth, and would not know it if it was staring you in the face?" Mr. Rankin went on to point out another lie issued by Sullivan, stating, "When a crowbar was produced, you swore to the police you had never seen it before. That was a downright deliberate lie. That was the crowbar you hit Diane Sindall with." As he had stated during his questioning from the defence, Sullivan insisted he was not responsible for Diane's death. He had not been on Borough Road where the murder took place, nor had he been on Bidston Hill, where her charred belongings were found. It would emerge that the individual who had seen him on Bidston Hill had been someone he had played darts with years earlier, and although this person could not pick Sullivan out in a lineup, thus rendering him an unreliable witness, it would be the defendant who ended up placing himself at Bidston Hill. It was stated that during an interview, Sullivan disclosed that he knew the name of the witness who had apparently seen him at the beauty spot, causing detectives to believe that this was an inadvertent admission that he had been there. Trying to wade through Sullivan's statements, Mr. Rankin referred to the confession the defendant made, in which he claimed he wore a single glove on the night of the murder, which he had subsequently thrown away, and he admitted wiping down the crowbar to remove fingerprints, suggesting he had some forensic awareness, a point Mr. Rankin was eager to explore, as he asked, "The reason you had a glove is because that is the night you had the crowbar, and that is the night you encountered Diane Sindall." Sullivan denied this, responding, "It is untrue." Mr. Rankin, however, continued his questioning, stating, "And that is the night you clobbered her," injuries which the pathologist said were the worst he had seen outside a road accident. It was an accusation which Sullivan denied, and as the day came to an end, he knew his time before Mr. Rankin was not over. With a weekend of respite, he was back on the stand again on Monday morning. The prosecutor continued his questioning by asking Sullivan to recall an outfit he had worn, namely a red jumper and a pair of brown trousers, which it was claimed were disposed of following the murder. The trousers had allegedly been cast into the murky waters of Morpeth Dock, while the red jumper he had thrown into the undergrowth at Bidston Hill. The latter item Mr. Rankin would focus on in more detail, producing a red jumper for the court, but when Sullivan was asked if it belonged to him, the defendant said no. However, he did admit that a similar jumper, which had been shown to the jury on the previous Thursday, was his, despite it being too big for him. Sceptical of this claim, Mr. Rankin insisted that was a deliberate subterfuge on Thursday, indulged in by you to delude the jury. Throughout his questioning, the defendant had grown increasingly agitated, and with this insinuation he angrily responded that it was not the case. He had the opportunity to regain his composure, as the trial was concluded for the day, but the following morning he would be under the scrutiny of Mr. Rankin once more. Having already emphasised the multitude of conflicting statements provided by Sullivan, the prosecutor would also inform the jury that some of his claims were remarkably accurate for an individual who states that he was not involved. This included being able to pinpoint the precise location where Diane's burned belongings were found. Mr. Rankin questioned this precision, asking Sullivan, quote, "That was an astonishingly accurate guess. You could have put it anywhere within 150 acres, but you put it adjacent to where the clothes were found. Why there, if it is not true?" He went on to state further details Sullivan had provided to the police. "You mentioned to police about a bank paying-in book being at Bidston Hill. You could only know about that because you handled the contents of Diane's bag. The prosecutor refuted Sullivan's claims that these were just guesses, by exclaiming, "With your guesswork, you could win $1 million on the pools." Then proceeded to ask the defendant, "Why were you telling police in such accurate detail where you were and what you were doing on Bidston Hill? It is an astonishing story, which happens to be virtually accurate." In spite of Mr. Rankin's persistence, Sullivan continued to state that it was merely a fluke that he got the details correct, insisting that his confession had been false, but he could not explain what made him lie. Upon Sullivan leaving the stand, Prosecutor Andrew Rankin QC presented the Crown's closing arguments, reiterating that the evidence, particularly the bite marks on the body, alongside Sullivan's own words, made it a certainty that he was the murderer. He addressed the jury directly and asked them to, quote, "Exercise your common sense. It does not depart you because you are sitting there in that box. The evidence calls for you to use that common sense, the more so in a case like this. Judge the evidence by the standards you would use to judge the validity of what is being said to you in your ordinary life." Mr. Rankin reminded them of the horrible injuries inflicted upon Diane. Injuries which he recalled the pathologist described as, quote, "the worst he had seen outside of a severe road traffic accident." Mr. Rankin conceded that there was no witnesses to the murder, and they could not say with certainty what occurred that night, but he added, "In my submission, the Crown has proved Peter Sullivan was in Borough Road, accosting, assaulting, and killing Diane Sindall." He went on to discuss what was arguably the strongest evidence against Sullivan, the presence of bite marks on the body, which forensic odontologist Dr. MacDonald had stated with certainty were a match to the defendant's teeth. The prosecutor recalled that the defence had not provided any evidence to contradict what was described as lucid, coherent, cogent, and compelling evidence from the doctor. Mr. Rankin went on to inform the jury that they had 3 potential ways to view the bite marks. They could consider the significance of them on their own, or in the context alongside the rest of the case. Or they may view the case without this piece of evidence. However, he argued that whichever approach they take would, quote, "nevertheless lead them to a conclusion of guilty." In rebuttal to these claims, the defence proceeded to ask the jury to consider that Sullivan, despite being a liar, was not responsible for the murder, pleading with the 9 men and 3 women to not brand a fool and leave the real murderer still at large. Continuing, Mr. Kay said, "The defendant is a fool and a danger to himself at times, in that he says things which cannot possibly benefit him. They are things which do him a lot of harm, the very opposite of the grossly cunning man alleged by the Crown. If you wrongly brand this defendant a murderer, however innocently you do that, you do him the most almighty disservice." Upon the arguments for the defence and prosecution being heard, Judge Temple began his summing up, informing the jury that, quote, "This is not a whodunit case," adding, "You do not have to decide who did it. The issue is whether the prosecution has made you sure the man in the dock did it." The judge would stipulate that the jury should not allow the extensive injuries inflicted upon Diane to influence them. Referring to the images which had been presented during the trial, he told them, "You have had to consider photographs which depict the obscene enormity of that which befell this girl. You must not allow your very natural reactions on such matters to in any way influence your judgment. Emotional reactions have no place in the jury box or jury room." Having advised them to use logic rather than rely on emotion, the judge continued, with him now focusing on the defendant, starting with the confession he had made and then retracted. Judge Temple warned, You may think it is no lighter matter to admit to murder, going on to state that accused or suspected persons sometimes lie to protect someone else, or to save themselves embarrassment, or out of confusion or panic. If you think there might be some alternative explanation for the lies, you should ignore them. But if you are sure they were not prompted by an innocent or alternative motion, then those lies should be evidence of guilt. The judge went on to address the evidence provided by various individuals, including that given by forensic odontologist Dr. Donald MacDonald, who had told the court that he believed that Sullivan's teeth matched the impressions found on Diane's body. While this evidence may have seemed compelling to the jury, Judge Temple cautioned them that, quote, "In this country we do not have trial by experts. The opinion of the experts are not binding upon you." Dr. MacDonald's testimony wasn't the only evidence that the judge would advise the jury to consider with care, with them being warned that the evidence of Stephen France, the man who claimed Sullivan confessed to him while they were in Risley, should also be considered carefully. Judge Temple stated, "When a man with a criminal record gives evidence, you must of course be astute and subjected to some exquisite degree of scrutiny. Such a man may lie and may have a reason to lie. You may remember because he fell into the category of the prison population which is known as cons rather than beasties. He may have an improper motive for giving evidence." The judge's summing up would be interrupted on the 30th of October 1987 when the 6-week-long trial came to a halt, as Sullivan's legal team produced new information. Having had private discussions with the opposing counsels for an hour, the decision was made to pause proceedings and send the jury home while the details were investigated. The reason for this interruption would be revealed when the trial reconvened on Monday the 2nd of November. The Liverpool courtroom fell silent as they heard that a man, referred to in court as Mr. X, had confessed to finding Diane's body at 6 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of August 1986. But instead of reporting the discovery, he stole her belongings, taking the money from her purse. He also took her clothing, earrings, and a handbag to Bidston Hill and used white spirit to burn it, pinpointing the location where this occurred as being an area just off Viner Road North. Details of Mr. X's confession were disclosed to the court by defence counsel Mr. John Kay, who informed them that the man had provided the police with a description of Diane's clothing, the colour of her bag, the fact it contained a paying book, and he claimed her money was strewn on the ground near her body. Mr. Kay added that, quote, "On August the 28th, 1986, a man was arrested by police, and, in the course of interviews, claimed he had found the body of Diane Sindall. He gave a detailed account of what he saw, including a description of the injuries to the body, and the way in which the body was lying. He drew a sketch and gave a demonstration using a police officer lying on the ground to show where the body was. It seemed he had provided the police with remarkably accurate details pertaining to the case, but the prosecution's counsel, Mr. David Madison, who had taken over from Mr. Andrew Rankin, called into question whether this evidence could be trusted. It was revealed that within hours of initially confessing to the discovery and theft, the man retracted his statement and claimed he had furnished his confession with details he saw in the newspapers and acquired from other individuals. Mr. Madison would point out that, unlike Sullivan, Mr. X had not mentioned the picture of Diane and her fiancé, which she kept in her bag, a detail which had been withheld from the papers, stating, "It will be obvious that a good deal of details about the murder, as you might expect in the circumstances, appeared in the press," adding, "This man said he also got information from Arrow Park Hospital and directly through a policeman. He had information about the murder from all sorts of sources. Mr. K for the defence would counter this claim by stating that someone who acquired details which were public knowledge and filled in the gaps with good guesses could, quote, get a tremendous amount of the detail right. Going on to state about Mr. X, if that man had been in the dock, could not a great deal of the cross-examination been put by Mr. Rankin to him? Continuing to reference the cross-examination carried out by the prosecution, who had insinuated that Sullivan was so good at guessing he should do the pools, Mr. K asked whether Mr. X could not he have been someone else, who, it could have been said, ought to do the pools, because he could have guessed matters and got them right. However, the evidence pertaining to Mr. X was mute, given that he had retracted his statement. He had been interviewed by the police multiple times, and an impression of his teeth were taken, but deemed to be incompatible with the marks on the body. All this resulted in the individual being eliminated from the inquiry. But given what is now known about this case, one cannot help but wonder whether Mr. X's testimony is more relevant than initially believed. Is it possible he was telling the truth, but withdrew his statement out of fear that instead of being charged with theft, he would be implicated in the murder? At the time, however, his evidence was deemed irrelevant, and the jury was summoned back into the courtroom to hear the remainder of Judge Temple's summing up. He surmised the Crown's case against Sullivan, whom they claimed had seen Diane walking along Borough Road shortly after midnight on August 2nd, 1986. They proposed that he attacked the 21-year-old with a crowbar borrowed from a neighbour, leaving her body lying in a desolate alleyway. He then fled the area and took measures to destroy vital evidence, including the burning of Diane's belongings, yet he had left clues at the scene, such as bite marks on her body. The judge went on to reference the differing statements made by the defendant regarding what he had done that night, at least one of which included a confession which he later retracted. The jury were reminded that Sullivan alleged he had been playing darts in the Crown pub in Birkenhead, which was one of the only parts of his alibi which could be corroborated. It was also revealed that shortly before the trial commenced, an alibi notice was lodged by the defence. In this alibi, Sullivan had claimed he left the Crown public house, accompanied by a lady called Bernadette Smith and her mother, with him alleging that the trio shared a taxi to a fish and chip shop. While at the shop, Sullivan alleged he conversed with a man called George and his wife, alongside another individual who was said to be known by the nickname Suggy, and he had the same surname as Sullivan. Having visited the fish and chip shop, the defendant claimed he then headed home alone. However, Judge Temple highlighted the issues with this alibi, warning the jury that Sullivan, quote, does not have to prove his alibi, adding the jury should not hold it against Sullivan that none of the people he claimed to have spoken to that night had appeared at the trial, stating they should, quote, accept the omissions were due to the fault, if fault it be, of his solicitors. Upon the conclusion of the judge's summing up, the jury of 9 men and 3 women were sent out to deliberate at 11:30 on Tuesday the 3rd of November 1987. They, like Diane's family, had sat through a grueling 6.5-week trial, during which graphic details and images pertaining to how Diane Sindall had died were displayed. But they were also provided compelling evidence by witnesses such as Dr. MacDonald. It would be a long and arduous deliberation, with each minute ticking by prolonging the agony already been endured by Diane's loved ones, who sat in the courtroom anxiously awaiting the verdict. The answer would come after 9 hours of deliberation and an overnight break. When the jury returned the following day, they delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty. The proclamation elicited a cry of, "Oh God, no, no," from the tearful Margaret Sullivan, who throughout the trial had remained adamant that her son was innocent. As she was comforted by her younger son Mark, sobs of relief could be heard emitting from Diane's mother and her two aunties, as the pent-up emotions of the last several weeks swelled to the surface. Judge Temple addressed the court following this proclamation, stating that the murder of Diane Sindall was, quote, "a crime which constituted an abomination and an outrage." Turning to Sullivan, who stood passively in the dock, Judge Temple informed him this killing was of a brutal ferocity and obscene enormity. Proceeding, he stated, "A young girl whose vehicle had run out of petrol was confronted, assaulted, and killed, not in a rural area, but on a main road in an urban area. The only sentence I can impose upon you is the maximum, and that is life imprisonment." After watching the man deemed responsible for Diane's death be led away to start his sentence, her loved ones filed out of Liverpool Crown Court to face the awaiting press. Diane's tearful fiancé, David Beattie, was seen hugging her parents as he struggled to hold back his emotions in order to speak, telling the journalists, "I just hate him for what he did to Diane," but added, "I do feel relieved Sullivan has got what he deserves, but in another way that could never be so. In a perfect world, his life would have been taken, and Diane would have been brought back to me." As they had done since the day Diane died, her parents stood beside David. The trio had provided each other comfort and support, and now they shared in the relief that someone had been held accountable for Diane's murder. Her father, Brian, told the press he got what he deserved, adding, "We are glad it is all over. It has been a long and exhausting wait. The police have had to work very hard, and we would like to thank them for bringing this to a conclusion. I only wish the judge had imposed a minimum of 30 years on him. Our priority now is to try and get back to a normal life. I don't think we will ever get over it at all. We will always remember Diane. We have 2 other lovely daughters and a son, and hopefully this will now be the end of a chapter in our lives. We will try to put it in its place and live on." The Sindalls would later share with the Liverpool Daily Post how they felt while sitting through the trial, recalling that for a year they had been protected, not knowing the full details of Diane's death, which were so clinically presented during the court proceedings. Having heard how his daughter had been pulled into the desolate alleyway and subjected to a horrific physical and sexual assault, her father Brian stated, "We simply had no idea how bad it was until that moment. We were sick. I could not believe anyone could do that to another human being. There is murder, but what he did to our lovely daughter was savage, bestial. He systematically destroyed her body. I wish they would hang him, but nothing they do to Sullivan can bring us back or die. She was part of us for 21 years and has been like losing a limb. We will never get over it or stop remembering her." His wife Wendy added, "I just pray that she did not suffer too much, that it was over quickly. I will always be bitter. I am bitter to think that whatever happens to him will be too good. He is here, being looked after while Diane is gone forever. And what is worse is that he will be out in 10 or 20 years to do it again. Already I feel sorry for the next victim. He must never, ever be allowed out onto the streets again. I have stared at him in court and he has not once shown any sign of remorse. I never believed in capital punishment before, but I do now. I would see him hang." Nothing will convince me he is sick. He knew exactly what he was doing to our daughter. He was so clinical about it, and I still say there were two of them. He is covering up for someone. The worst thought is that she could have been alive for 2 hours afterwards, just lying there. I pray she did not suffer and that it was instant, but I will never know. It wasn't only their daughter's life that the murder had taken from the Sindalls family, but it had tainted the memories that filled the home where she had grown up. For every happy moment was now tinged with pain, prompting Wendy and Brian to sell the property. Reflecting on the thoughts that lingered regarding Diane's lost future, Wendy told the Liverpool Echo, "I think about how she should have been marrying David this year, how much she adored him, how much she wanted to have a baby before her 22nd birthday. She loved children." Diane's devastated fiancé would also speak to the newspaper. He would disclose how he had been with Diane since they were 16. They had planned a life together, acquired a flat and a Labrador puppy they named Whitbread after seeing the name on a coaster in a pub. After Diane's death, Whitbread became David's sole companion on his frequent walks to her grave at St Andrew's Cemetery, where he would silently contemplate their life together and the future that had so cruelly been torn away. Regarding the night of the murder, he recalled to the Liverpool Echo the last time he saw Diane. She had come to his flat after finishing work at the florist's, with him distinctly remembering her sitting on the sideboard, shortly after which she bid him goodbye and drove off in her little blue van. While Diane was working her shift at the pub, David headed out to celebrate the first anniversary of a car repair business of which he was a partner. By midnight, he and his friends had headed to a nightclub just half a mile away from where Diane's van ran out of fuel. And while David celebrated, he could never have known that his 21-year-old fiancée was walking towards her death. Speaking of her murder, David told the Liverpool Echo, "I just pray it is true that she knew nothing about it, that she did not suffer. I know what type of girl she was. She would have been terrified. She might have told him to get lost. She might just have burst into tears. She might have tried to scream, but been unable to. I keep trying to picture exactly what happened to her, but I will never know for certain. They cannot punish Sullivan enough for me. He knew he had done it, but not once did he show any remorse. All he could think about was how he could try and get away with it. The guy is obviously a complete madman. They should put him to sleep like a sick dog. I don't want to be paying to keep him in prison, and he must never be let out." For David, the devastation of learning that Diane was dead was compounded by the manner in which he was treated by the police in the early stages of the investigation. He remembered being treated like a suspect, brought into Birkenhead police station, where he had to endure several hours of questioning. It was an experience he said he could never forget, stating to the paper that the police were, quote, "telling me that in 90% of these cases it is the family or the boyfriend." They were asking me questions, very personal questions. It was just a nightmare. Nothing was sinking in, and though I was trying to answer them, I was crying and could hardly talk. I was hungry and my stomach was turning and turning. They had me until well after midnight. But once they realised I was not under suspicion, they were great with me. Diane's death did not just impact her loved ones, but the whole community, especially women. It prompted the first Take Back the Night march in Birkenhead. Other such gatherings had occurred during the Yorkshire Ripper murders, when women gathered to walk at night and raise awareness of the dangers they face. Birkenhead March took place on International Women's Day. The large crowd of women began their nighttime march close to where Diane's van had run out of fuel, and concluded at the spot where the 21-year-old had died, with the intention of highlighting the lack of safety for women who were walking alone at night. A year after this candlelit march, crowds would congregate once more at the spot on Borough Road, this time for the unveiling of a 2-foot-tall memorial stone paid for by money raised from the previous event. It was inscribed with the statement, "Diane Sindall, murdered August 2nd, 1986, because she was a woman. In memory of all our sisters who have been raped and murdered, we will never let it be forgotten." A spokeswoman at the event would state that the stone would act not only as a memorial to Diane, but a constant reminder of the risks facing women alone at night. The stone had been unveiled by Sue Johnston, at the time famous for her role as Sheila Grant in the television soap Brookside. Her character had a storyline involving being raped, yet Sue had also been a survivor of an attack, giving her a very personal reason to support the campaign, with the actress stating, "We have to start building a future where women can walk the streets in safety. It is very tragic that we have to be here at all, where Diane died. But if there is any hope to be gained from this, it is that we might make people stop and think about the issue. Having been attacked myself, I know it is something you never get over. It changes your life. Women who have been attacked live in fear. That is just not acceptable in 1988. It is disconcerting to think that almost 40 years later, we are still echoing the words of Sue Johnston, except we now state that it is just not acceptable in 2026. While Diane's death highlighted the dangers that women face, it, alongside other such cases, fueled the conversation regarding the reinstatement of the death penalty, a debate which had been brewing since the crimes of Peter Sutcliffe and the Moors murderers came to light, with the latter two individuals going to trial in 1966, a year after its abolition. In hindsight, this would prove to be a case highlighting one of the objections against capital punishment. But in 1987, there appeared to be strong evidence supporting the guilty verdict. This included the fact that Sullivan initially lied about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and then went on to provide varying statements related to his actions on the 1st and 2nd of August. Initially, he claimed he was at home watching television, and when confronted with the discovery he had actually been at the Crown pub, just 8 minutes' walk from the crime scene, Sullivan alleged that he had simply forgotten that he was there due to it being a couple of weeks prior. He also wavered on his whereabouts on the 3rd of August, despite the police having a witness that placed him on Bidston Hill at the time police believed Diane's belongings had been deposited and burned. Although the witness failed to pick Sullivan out in a lineup, the suspect was able to name the individual who had seen him at the location, strengthening the notion that the witness sighting was accurate. It was also deemed suspicious that in the aftermath of the murder, Sullivan headed to London, although he alleged it was because he was looking for work. When Sullivan was spotted by 2 police officers at Morpeth Docks in Birkenhead, he told them he had disposed of clothing because he didn't want a homeless person to get hold of them. However, the prosecution would suggest he was disposing of incriminating evidence. In relation to his clothing, fibres were recovered from the scene which could be linked to his clothes and a sofa at his home, although a forensic scientist would state that they held little merit due to the limited sample. Police also determined that Sullivan had been in possession of a crowbar, which was likely the murder weapon, and it was surmised that he had taken steps to destroy evidence by wiping down the item after the murder. When he was arrested in September 1987, Sullivan provided several differing statements, suggesting a deceitful nature. At one point, he confessed to the crime, but subsequently retracted it. However, he apparently gave details which only the perpetrator would have known. Upon being charged with the murder, Sullivan was placed on remand at Risley, where he allegedly confessed to a fellow inmate while awaiting trial. The most crucial evidence pertained to the bite marks on Diane's body, which the jury were told matched with Sullivan's dentistry. Given the strength of this evidence, it is hard to conceive that the jury would have come to any other conclusion than guilty, and there were likely very few people who would have believed the verdict was wrong. Diane's killer had been caught, and a dangerous individual was behind bars, where he would remain for 38 years. Yet a key piece of evidence held in storage would change everything. Join me next time as I delve into the life of Peter Sullivan and what led to his case becoming one of the longest miscarriages of justice in British legal history.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.